The year was 1785. The morning was damp and grey, and the furrows of a Hampshire field glistened with dew. A farmer, nameless to history, drove his plough through the soil, expecting nothing more than another day of toil, but then his blade struck something hard. At first, he thought it a stone, perhaps a shard of brick, remnants of some forgotten ruin. Yet as he bent down and brushed the earth away, what emerged was unlike anything he had seen before. In his hand lay a heavy band of gold, not a coin, not jewelry of the sort worn by his neighbors, but a ring large, striking, and ancient. Its size was unusual, far too bulky for an ordinary finger, and the farmer, uneducated in antiquities, could not have known that it was nearly 1,600 years old, dating back to the waning centuries of Roman Britain. He had stumbled, quite by accident, into a mystery that spanned continents and centuries. The ring's weight was astonishing. Crafted from thick gold, it could have been designed to be worn over a glove, a mark of status rather than of comfort. On its square bezel bore a figure carefully engraved, the goddess Venus, goddess of love and beauty, etched into its face with fine lines that still shone, despite the centuries in the soil. And beneath the goddess, a name was carved, Venus, spelled out clearly, leaving no doubt of the deity's identity. This was not a trinket. It was a sigil of power, a signet ring meant to leave its mark in wax, pressed upon documents or possessions. When sealed, Venus herself would appear on the imprint, accompanied by the name of the goddess. To wear such a ring was to carry divine authority at one's fingertips, but there was more. The band itself was faceted into 10 sharp planes, and across its surface ran a Latin inscription. At first glance, and the words seemed almost nonsensical, as if the engraver's hand had slipped. The phrase read awkwardly, Senicianus vivas, in deis. A doubled I, a missing O, an error. Yet scholars later realized what it should have said, Seniciana vivas in dideo. Translated, it meant Senicianus, may you live in God. And here lay the paradox. On the face of the ring Venus, a goddess of pagan Rome. On the band, a prayer to the Christian God. Two worlds etched into one artifact. A relic of a time when faiths overlapped uneasily, when old gods and the new Christ shared the same soil, the same empire, and sometimes the same piece of gold. For the farmer, this was simply treasure. He could not know that the ring carried a name, and with it, a story of betrayal, theft, and divine vengeance. The name belonged not to a saint, not to a noble, but to a thief. And somewhere, buried in another place, another object waited, a curse carved into lead, demanding that the gods themselves exact justice upon the man called Senicianus. The farmer would take his find to local collectors, and within months it reached the Society of Antiquaries in London, displayed before gentlemen scholars hungry for relics of Rome. It caused a stir, yes, but then it vanished into private hands. For decades it sat unseen, a curiosity in a noble's collection, forgotten except by those who dusted it. But the soil of Britain was not done speaking. For 80 miles away, in the ruins of a temple dedicated to a Celtic god, a second artifact would surface, a tablet, a prayer, and a curse, and on that curse, a name Senicianus. The link between these two objects would not be realized for another century, but when it was, it would transform the farmer's chance discovery into one of archaeology's strangest mysteries, a Roman ring, a pagan goddess, a Christian prayer, and a thief cursed for eternity. And this is only the beginning. Picture the 4th century after Christ. Roman Britain was a land divided between fading traditions and the new creed of Christianity. Temples still stood, and incense still burned before Jupiter and Venus, but Christian bishops were preaching in villas and towns. Imperial edicts increasingly favored the new faith. It was a century of collision, where old gods were not yet gone, and the cross was not yet alone upon the skyline. The gold ring unearthed in that Hampshire field embodies this tension in a way few artifacts can. On its bezel, Venus gazes outward, serene, eternal, a figure of sensual beauty, carved by Roman hands, and yet circling the band is a phrase that could not be more Christian Senicianus. May you live in God, an image, Christian blessing, fused into a single object. And how can this be explained? Scholars have argued, and one interpretation holds that the ring was forged during the time of Emperor Constantine's reforms, when Christianity was legal, but pagan cults still thrived. Perhaps the ring was repurposed, its pagan face preserved, while its band was recut with a new inscription. A practical recycling of old luxury. Or perhaps it belonged to a man caught between two worlds, unwilling to abandon Venus, but eager for the protection of Christ. There is another possibility. Some scholars believe that the pairing of Venus and Christ was not a compromise, but an act of defiance. Imagine Senicianus, wealthy enough to commission such a ring, deliberately inscribing his Christian loyalty on the band while still displaying the goddess of love for all to see. Was this arrogance, syncretism, or superstition? No one can say for sure. Yet the most arresting detail is not the goddess or the blessing. It is the name, Senicianus, a rare name, barely recorded in the annals of Roman Britain. To have it inscribed so boldly on the ring suggests ownership, a declaration, this is mine. In a world where property could be stolen, names etched into gold were both identity and defense. But here lies the paradox that would puzzle antiquarians centuries later. If this ring belonged to Senicianus, why does a curse tablet from another site invoke his name as that of a thief? Was this truly his ring, or did he take it from another? In January 1786, the ring was presented by a local nobleman, Lord Arundel, before the Society of Antiquaries in London. Learned men peered at it under candlelight, deciphering its inscription, tracing its goddess. They praised its craftsmanship, debated its meaning, and then it vanished again, slipping into private hands, and eventually it came into the possession of the Shute family, antiquarians who housed it in the library of their Tudor estate, the Vine. For decades it gathered dust, overlooked, while the fields and forests of Britain kept their silence, and that silence would not last. In the early 19th century, in the ruins of a Roman temple miles away in Gloucestershire, a discovery would emerge. A lead tablet, etched with words both desperate and furious. A curse, imploring the gods to destroy a man until justice was done. And there, inscribed in Latin letters, was a name, Senicianus. High above the River Severn in Gloucestershire lies Lydney Park, where the ruins of a Roman temple still cling to the hillside. In the early 19th century, archaeologists and treasure seekers alike scoured the site. Amidst mosaics, coins, and votive offerings, they uncovered a small, easily overlooked object, a thin sheet of lead, carefully inscribed in Latin. It was not a prayer for peace, it was a demand for vengeance. This was a defixio accursed tablet. In Roman religion, such tablets were a means of justice when earthly courts could not suffice. The wronged would scratch their grievances onto lead, fold or nail the tablet, and deposit it in a temple or sacred spring. The gods were then asked to strike the guilty and to torment them until they confessed or restored what was stolen. The Lydney tablet bore such a plea, addressed to the Celtic Roman god Nodens, a deity of healing, the sea, and perhaps the hunt. It spoke with desperate fury for the god Nodens. Silvianus has lost a ring and has donated half its worth to Nodens. Among those named Senicianus, permit no health until he brings it back to the temple of Nodens, is one of the most chilling texts to survive from Roman Britain. Man, named Silvianus, had lost a ring. He vowed to give half its value to the god if the thief was punished, and he named his suspect Senicianus. The curse is relentless, and it does not merely ask for the ring's return. It demands that Senicianus be denied health itself until he obeys. The words are stark, but one detail is even stranger. At the top of the tablet, someone perhaps years later scratched the word rediviva, meaning renewed, as if the curse had been refreshed, reignited to ensure it remained potent. Whoever wrote it wanted the gods to remember, and here is where history twists upon itself. The name Senicianus is not common, yet it appears here, etched into lead at Lydney, and it appears on the gold ring unearthed 80 miles away in Hampshire, one a thief, one an owner, which was true. Did Senicianus engrave his own name upon stolen treasure to claim it as his own? Was the Christian blessing an attempt to shield himself from divine wrath by invoking the new god of Rome? Imagine the scene, Silvianus. Armentima, stricken with loss, climbs the hill to Nodens Eple's temple. He kneels, lays his offering, and scratches the curse into lead. The words are heavy with anger. Perhaps he never saw Senicianus again. Perhaps he died waiting for the gods to avenge him. Yet centuries later, the ring itself surfaced, bearing the thief's name, as if mocking the curse. In 1888, long after both ring and tablet had been discovered, a connection was made. Charles Chute, Lord of the Vine and custodian of the ring, published a history of his estate. He described the artifact in his possession and, crucially, reproduced the inscription. From the Lydney curse, for the first time, the link was made public. The ring in Hampshire might well be the very ring cursed at Lydney. Coincidence? Or evidence of a crime frozen in time? When Charles Chute placed the two inscriptions side by side, the Christian blessing etched into the gold ring, and the furious words carved into the Lydney tablet, the connection seemed impossible to ignore. Both bore the rare name Senicianus. Voisin both involved a ring, and both told a story of ownership, though from opposite perspectives. The Chute family, themselves passionate antiquarians, understood the thrill of discovery. For them, the vine ring was no longer just a curiosity in a cabinet. It was evidence of a theft committed over 1,000 years earlier. In their hands lay the very object that Silvianus had cursed. They were convinced of it, yet not all historians agreed. Skeptics warned against the temptation of coincidence. Could there not have been more than one Senicianus in Roman Britain after all? Names repeat, even rare ones. And the distance between the two sites, Hampshire and Gloucestershire, was nearly 80 miles. Would a thief truly have carried stolen treasure so far? Or had the ring travelled through other hands before being buried? But the arguments in favour of a link were compelling. The ring's inscription, clumsy in its lettering, suggests it may not have been commissioned with reverence, but with haste, perhaps the thief marking his prize. Some scholars believe Senicianus was arrogant enough to engrave his own name upon what he had stolen, a way of overwriting Silvianus's ownership. The Christian blessing, too, may have been a kind of shield. If cursed by a pagan god, why not counter it with the power of the Christian one? It was a bold, almost mocking act of defiance to steal, to engrave, and to sanctify the theft all at once. Imagine Senicianus, perhaps a soldier or minor official, holding the stolen ring in his hand. He knows Silvianus has gone to the temple, has spoken words of vengeance to the god Nodens. Fear gnaws at him. What if the curse is real? What if sickness, misfortune, or death is already on its way? He takes the ring to a craftsman, orders his name inscribed, demands a prayer to the Christian god be carved into its band. Not only a claim of ownership, but a desperate amulet against divine reprisal. The irony is bitter. In trying to shield himself from a curse, Senicianus may have ensured his infamy. For centuries later, his name still whispers through museum cases and archaeological reports. Silvianus is forgotten, but Senicianus lives on, branded forever as thief. This tension between pagan vengeance and Christian invocation, between theft and ownership, fascinated Victorian scholars. The story of the cursed ring became a parable for them, a glimpse into the spiritual confusion of late Roman Britain, and a reminder that greed and fear have never been strangers. But the story did not stop with antiquarian debate. In the early 20th century, and the tale of the ring reached an unlikely scholar at Oxford, a man who delighted in myths, languages, and the power of objects both real and imagined. His name was J.R.R. Tolkien. In 1929, the Lydney Temple site was once again the focus of excavation. Dr. Mortimer Wheeler, one of Britain's most prominent archaeologists, directed the dig. Among the ruins of mosaics and shrines, he revisited the mysterious cursed tablet. The strange deity invoked there Nodens posed a puzzle. Who was this god? What were his origins? Wheeler, recognizing the limits of his own expertise, sought the advice of a colleague at Oxford. That colleague was a philologist, a scholar of language and myth, who had already begun shaping a private world of elves, dwarves, and ancient tongues. His name was John Ronald Reuel Tolkien. For Tolkien, the assignment was modest. He was asked to study the name Nodens and its linguistic roots, but it is hard to imagine he did not also hear the tale of the curse and the ring. Wheeler, like many antiquarians, would have delighted in the drama of the story, a stolen treasure, a thief's name etched into gold, a plea to the gods for vengeance. It was, in essence, a legend waiting to be told. And Tolkien, never a collector of legends, may have filed it away in his imagination. And think of the parallels in a powerful ring, scribed with words of both faith and defiance. A curse laid down to ensure the thief's misery, a sense that divine or supernatural forces contend over ownership of a single object. It is not difficult to see the echoes that would later emerge in Tolkien's fiction, and the ring at the vine, though heavy and golden, would one day find its shadow in the one ring of Middle-earth, also inscribed, also cursed, also capable of warping the fate of its bearer. We must be cautious. Tolkien himself never admitted such a connection. In his vast letters and essays, he makes no mention of Silvianus or Senicianus. Yet scholars point to the timing. Just a few years after Wheeler's excavation, Tolkien began writing The Hobbit. Soon after, he would craft The Lord of the Rings. Could the tale of the cursed Roman ring have served, if not as direct inspiration, then, as an unconscious spark, the ring unearthed in Hampshire, cursed in Gloucestershire, and studied by Oxford men had now crossed a threshold. It was no longer just an antiquarian curiosity. It had become part of modern myth. In the imaginations of readers, the cursed ring and the One Ring overlap. Two stories of greed, power, and doom tangled across millennia. The cursed ring of Silvianus reminds us that myths do not need to be invented whole. They grow from fragments of history, from half-forgotten names scratched on lead, from treasures buried in fields, from curses whispered in temples. They grow from real fear and real theft, woven into stories that outlast those who lived them. But the saga of the Vine Ring is only half the tale, for in the very decades when Tolkien was shaping his legend of rings and power, archaeologists elsewhere in Britain were uncovering a far darker mystery, not of treasure, but of bodies, dozens of them, headless, mutilated, and buried with unsettling care. The story shifts from rings and curses in Hampshire to something far more macabre in the north of England. The place is York, once called Iberacum, a vital Roman stronghold. By the 2nd and 3rd centuries AD, it was not just a provincial town, but the beating heart of military command in northern Britain. Legions marched from its gates, emperors resided in its walls, and orders rippled from York to the edges of the empire, but centuries later, it's in the quiet suburbs of the modern city. An eerie discovery was made. Around the year 2000, as builders dug foundations in an ordinary neighborhood known as Driffield Terrace, their tools struck bone. Archaeologists were summoned, expecting perhaps the remnants of a forgotten cemetery. What they found was indeed a cemetery, but one unlike any they had seen before. Kings' skeletons lay beneath the soil, male, young to middle-aged, most of them tall and powerfully built. Yet nearly all shared a grim fate. They had been decapitated. Some were buried with their skulls tucked neatly by their feet. Others had the head placed upon the chest, as though watching over the lifeless body. In certain cases, the skulls lay between the legs, silent sentinels of their own corpses. These were not careless burials. The arrangements showed intention, ritual, perhaps even respect. And yet, the cause of death was unmistakable. These men had lost their heads literally. For archaeologists, the sight was chilling. This was no random scattering of bones. It was a community of the executed, all male, all strong, all violently ended. But why at first glance? One might assume criminals. Roman Britain, like the rest of the empire, punished serious offences with beheading, but the sheer number, eventually more than 80 skeletons, raised doubts. Could so many criminals have been buried in one place, and with such strange care? As investigations deepened, another detail emerged. The bones were not ordinary, and many showed signs of a life of violence. Utens had been heavily developed, especially on the right arms, as though trained for combat. Healed wounds spoke of old battles, while fresher cuts hinted at a brutal end. And in one case, most astonishingly, a bone bore the unmistakable mark of a lion's bite. The men of Driffield Terrace had lived and died in violence, but not just any violence of spectacle. And to the archaeologists piecing together this puzzle, one possibility stood out: gladiators, men who fought for Roman crowds, who battled beasts, who trained until their very bodies became sculpted by combat, and when defeated, they might be granted an honorable burial, even if their lives had been ended with the sword. York, it seemed, was hiding a second great mystery, a cemetery of headless Romans, preserved for nearly 2 millennia beneath English soil. Archaeologists often say that bones tell stories. At Driffield Terrace, the bones shouted. Each skeleton bore marks of a life lived on the edge of survival, and of a death both violent and deliberate. One of the most striking discoveries was the demographic pattern. Nearly all the dead were men, between their late teens and mid-30s prime years of strength. They were taller than average for Roman Britain, many over 5'9", with robust frames. Their bones showed heavy muscle attachments, particularly on the right arm and shoulder. This asymmetry hinted at long-term training with weapons, as though their bodies had been forged in constant combat. Then there were the wounds. Some skeletons displayed healed fractures, scars from earlier violence, broken ribs that had mended, skulls once cracked but repaired by time. Others bore fresh injuries inflicted at the moment of death, slashing cuts across vertebrae, sword marks gouging bone. Many necks showed a single clean severance, suggesting a practiced executioner's blade, but others bore signs of hesitation or excess multiple strokes, hacking cuts, grim evidence that not all deaths were swift. The lion bite was perhaps the most haunting. The tooth marks, unmistakable and deep, and belonged to a large carnivore. Huns, leopards, and bears were imported into Roman Britain for entertainment in the amphitheatre, and to find such a mark on a man buried in York was to glimpse a fight between human and beast that had ended in torn flesh. Yet despite the brutality of their ends, these men were not discarded like refuse. Many were buried with care. Cuts of meat, pork, beef, even horse were placed in the graves, offerings for the afterlife. Such rituals suggested honor, or at least acknowledgement, rather than shame. It was not the burial of criminals despised by society. It was the burial of men whose violent deaths may have carried a kind of respect. Still, questions multiplied. If they were gladiators, where was York's amphitheatre? No stone arena has yet been found in the city. Did they fight in a wooden structure that vanished with time? Or were these men soldiers, punished for mutiny or treason, or captives, executed en masse after rebellion? Science sought answers. Isotope analysis of their teeth showed diverse origins. Some men had grown up in Britain, but others came from France, Germany, and even the Mediterranean. One analysis suggested an individual from Syria. These were not all locals, and they were men drawn from across the empire, united in death beneath the soil of York. The cemetery whispered of spectacle, execution, and ritual, but it offered no single answer. Gladiators, soldiers, criminals. Each theory carried weight, each left gaps. What is certain is this: their decapitations were not random. They formed part of a pattern, a ritual, a message. As in Rome, death could be theatre, and the headless men of York may have been both victims and performers in a show long forgotten. The field at Driffield Terrace forces us into a historian's trial. 80 decapitated men, buried with care, yet slain with violence. Who were they? Three main theories emerge, each with compelling arguments and haunting gaps. And the first and most dramatic is the gladiator theory. Everything seems to fit their age, their strength, their asymmetrical bones trained for single-arm combat, even the lion bite. In Roman York, an amphitheatre has never been unearthed, but wooden arenas often left little trace. York was an imperial city, home to emperors like Septimius Severus. Gladiatorial games would have been expected entertainment for troops and citizens alike. The men buried here could have been those who lost their final battles, honored with meat offerings for the journey to the afterlife. This theory explains the violence, the diversity of origins, and the mix of respect and brutality. Yet without the amphitheatre itself, the picture is incomplete. The second theory casts them not as entertainers, but as soldiers. York was a legionary base, a hub of imperial authority, soldiers mutinied and deserted, or fell in political purges, and Roman punishment was swift. Decapitation was a favored method for traitors or criminals of rank. The burial's honorific nature could make sense if these men were disgraced soldiers punished, yet still granted rights of burial. Supporters of this theory often point to the turmoil following Septimius Severus's death in York in 211 AD, when his son, Caracalla, purged rivals and loyalists alike. Could this cemetery be the resting place of those purged in blood? Yet this does not explain the lion bite or the gladiator-like asymmetries etched into bone. The third theory sees them as condemned criminals or war captives. Rome's brutal system often executed its unfortunates by spectacle slaughtered in arenas, forced into rigged gladiatorial matches, or simply beheaded for public display. The shackles found on one skeleton support this view. Some of the men may have been executed en masse, and their heads struck off with swords and their bodies were arranged with grim order. But again, the respectful burials complicate the picture. Why honor the condemned with offerings of food if they were despised criminals unless, of course, they were victims meant to satisfy both justice and spectacle, punished in life, but not denied the rights of death? Each interpretation wrestles with contradictions. Gladiators explain the bones, but not the missing arena, and soldiers explain the setting, but not the lion bite. Criminals explain the shackles, but not the ritual offerings. Perhaps the truth lies in overlap. Some gladiators, some soldiers, some condemned men, all sharing the same fate of decapitation, buried together in death. The mystery of the headless Romans refuses a single answer, but in their silence, the bones force us to confront the blurred lines in Rome between punishment, entertainment, and honor. Science sharpened the story that ancient rumor and guesswork could not. For decades, archaeologists debated the headless Romans as if trapped in a riddle, but modern tools, DNA sequencing, isotope analysis, chemical testing finally gave the dead a voice. First, the isotopes are their teeth form in childhood, locking in the chemical fingerprint of the food and water one consumes. Oxygen and strontium levels vary across regions, and so each tooth becomes a map of origin. When scientists examined the York skeletons, they found startling diversity. A handful of men had isotope signatures consistent with northern Britain locals, but most came from far-away Gaul and the Germanic provinces, even the Mediterranean. A one man's chemical trace suggested Syria, thousands of miles away. These were not York-born men. They were foreigners, drawn or forced here, united only in violent death. The DNA confirmed the mixture. While many carried genetic markers common in Celtic Britain, others revealed ancestry tied to the wider empire. Soldiers conscripted from the provinces, gladiators purchased from distant markets, or captives dragged from conquered lands, each possibility fit. Kirkuk, perched on the northern frontier, was not a provincial backwater, but a melting pot of empire where men of many origins converged, and the skeletons themselves revealed more, and some showed overdeveloped right arms, as though forged by years of repetitive training with a sword or spear. Others bore healed wounds, broken ribs, cracked skulls, sliced bones that spoke of lives lived in combat before death came by executioner's blade. And then the shackled man, a heavy iron fetters still clamped around his ankles, locked fast even in the grave, a prisoner, executed and buried in chains. His story was clear, but he lay among men buried with meat offerings, as though honored, while the contradictions mounted. Gladiators trained for combat, soldiers executed in purges, criminals dispatched in judgment, all could be here. Mingled in a cemetery of violence, the graves suggested ritual, not chaos. Heads were placed with care at the feet, between the legs, or cradled on the chest. Food was laid in as though for a feast in the afterlife. Even in death, someone had honored them. Science proved what history had long suspected: this was no ordinary burial ground. These were not simple criminals dumped into earth. They were men of stature, strength, and struggle, gathered from across Rome's world, executed in York with a spectacle's precision. Yet the question remained, what exactly happened in York to bring them here? A massacre of gladiators, a purge of soldiers, a public execution of captives. The evidence pointed in all directions at once. Imagine the roar of a crowd rising over the stone and timber of Roman York. Thousands packed into seats, eager for the promise of blood. York's amphitheatre has never been uncovered, but Roman cities of this scale always had one. Whether in stone or wood, arenas were the heart of Roman spectacle, places where death became theatre. Gladiators, condemned criminals, and wild beasts were paraded before citizens and soldiers alike. The empire called it Ludi the Games. Officials called it tradition. For the crowd, it was both punishment and pleasure. Lions shipped from Africa, bears dragged from northern forests, men armed with sword and shield, all clashed for survival, while York cheered. The skeletons at Driffield Terrace fit this stage. Gladiators were not always slaves. Some volunteered, seeking fame, a prize money, or redemption. Were forced. The criminals condemned to damnatio ad ludum, the fate of the games. Execution was transformed into entertainment. A man could be chained, released into the arena, and told to fight to his death against trained killers or wild animals. And the crowd judged his courage. His body judged his fate. Roman texts described this duality with chilling clarity. To the audience, death was theatre. To the condemned, it was both agony and spectacle. Gladiator who fought bravely might be spared with the famous missio, a reprieve granted by the crowd's favour. But many were not spared. A defeated man could be finished with a swift blow to the head, or in some cases, decapitated as part of the show. Archaeological parallels reinforce York's mystery. In Ephesus, Turkey, a gladiator cemetery revealed the same mix of decapitation and ritual burial. In one case, a hammer blow had shattered a skull, echoing descriptions of arena executions. At York, and the careful burial of headless bodies with meat offerings suggests something similar. Men who died before a crowd, but were still laid to rest with honour. The lion bite sealed the connection. No soldier on campaign in Britain would have crossed paths with such an animal. Only in the arena could such a wound occur. The man who bore it was either mauled before an audience or trained in venationes, the hunts staged with exotic beasts. And his bones prove that York's games were not tamer than those in Rome itself. But the arena was not only for punishment. It was a ritual of Roman power, and to stage Maati Games in the north of Britain was to declare Rome's authority and to bind soldiers and citizens with spectacle. Blood on sand was the empire's most persuasive language, and the headless men of York, the Concon, may not be victims of crime or chaos. They may be the echoes of these games, the losers of battles staged for entertainment, their deaths ordered by Rome, their burials marking them as both condemned and honoured. Yet in Nahua, all historians agree, and some believe these were soldiers purged by imperial decree, their deaths political rather than theatrical. York was no stranger to emperors. In the early 3rd century, it was the imperial capital of the north, a fortress where decisions for the entire empire were made. Here, in 211 AD, Emperor Septimius Severus died after years of campaigning in Britain. His death left the empire in the hands of his two sons Caracalla and Geta brothers, who hated each other with venomous intensity. Their rivalry was notorious. Ancient sources describe the imperial palace split in two, each brother ruling his half with guards stationed at the doors. Meals were taken apart, conversations through messengers, plots whispered in shadows. Their mother, Julia Domina, tried to keep peace, but it was a fragile illusion. Caracalla, known for his cruelty and ambition, struck first. Within months of his father's death, he orchestrated the murder of his brother Geta, luring him into a meeting under the pretense of reconciliation. Geta was cut down in his mother's arms, Ascatius. Ancient historians claim more than 20,000 of Geta's supporters were executed in the purge that followed. Senators, orders, and ordinary citizens all were swept into the tide of blood that secured Caracalla's rule. As York, where the brothers had campaigned together, may have been one of the purge's epicenters. If loyalists to Geta were stationed here, Caracalla's wrath would have demanded swift vengeance. Decapitation was a favored method of eliminating traitors, and the headless graves at Driffield Terrace fit the pattern. Young, strong men soldiers in their prime cut down by imperial decree. The respectful burials complicate the theory, but do not disprove it. Soldiers executed for loyalty to the wrong brother might still have been honored in death by comrades or families. For the offerings and careful placement of heads could have been the last act of defiance, a way of preserving dignity in the face of imperial brutality. Historical accounts lend weight. Cassius Dio, the Roman historian, writes of Caracalla's paranoia and cruelty, his relentless drive to eliminate opposition. York Cemetery may be the silent testimony to this purge, the bones of men who backed the wrong heir in a Game of Thrones as old as Rome itself. And yet here lies the dilemma, the lion bite, and the gladiatorial asymmetries, and the man shackled in iron. These details resist the purge narrative. Badgers could be executed, but mauled by beasts, buried with the trappings of arena combat. The puzzle remains fractured. Were the headless men of York gladiators slain for spectacle, soldiers purged for politics, or criminals condemned for justice? Each theory holds fragments of truth, but none alone explains the whole. To understand better, we must step back from York and look to Rome itself, at how executions, games, and politics blended into one theatre of power, where the line between soldier, gladiator, and criminal blurred into nothing. Rome was an empire built on law and on spectacle. To the Romans, execution was never merely punishment. It was theatre, it was ritual, and politics combined, and the empire turned death into a performance designed to instruct, terrify, or entertain. Decapitation was among the more merciful methods, swift and final, but the empire had far darker sentences for the condemned. Criminals might be burned, crucified, or thrown to beasts in the arena, and these were not random cruelties, but carefully chosen punishments meant to reflect the nature of the crime. Theft, treason, desertion, rebellion each carried its own choreography of suffering. The damnatio ad bestias, condemnation to the beasts, was the most infamous. Condemned men, untrained and unarmed, were forced into the arena to face lions, leopards, or bears. Crowds filled amphitheaters to watch. Some criminals were disguised in costumes that mocked their alleged crimes or sins, transforming their deaths into grotesque parables, plays. Others were forced to play roles in reenactments of myths, slaughtered on cue to mimic legends of sacrifice. gladiatorial combat sat in a strange middle ground between punishment and entertainment. A trained gladiator could achieve fame, even honor. But for a condemned criminal sent to the games, survival was rare. He was little more than a prop, a body to be cut down for the crowd's delight. This culture of death spread across the empire, from Rome itself to provincial cities like York. Amphitheaters were more than arenas, they were stages of Roman dominance. As every execution, every spectacle, reminded subjects of the empire's authority. Blood on the sand was a warning. Rome governs life and death. The York skeletons carry echoes of this system. Decapitation suggests judicial execution, and the lion bite suggests damnatio ad bestias. The shackles suggest prisoners dragged to their fate. Yet the food, offerings, and careful burials suggest honor, not humiliation. Could these have been condemned men who fought bravely in the arena and earned respect in death, or soldiers who suffered political execution, their graves later dignified by grieving comrades? Historians wrestle with these contradictions. Some propose the York dead were a mix, a cemetery where executed criminals, fallen gladiators, and purged soldiers were laid together. A mass memory of Rome's many faces of death. What is certain is that Roman Britain was no stranger to brutality cloaked in ritual. Death was part of civic life, staged in amphitheaters, whispered in imperial courts, carried out on windswept frontiers. The headless men of York were part of this continuum, casualties of a world where justice and entertainment often blurred into the same performance. To unlock the final layer of their mystery, we must listen not only to bones but to science itself. Isotopes and DNA tools unknown to the ancients will speak where history and legend remain silent. The soil of York held the answers that words alone could not. Archaeologists turned to science, pulling secrets from bone and tooth, examining chemical traces and genetic fragments that survived centuries underground. What they found reshaped the story of the headless men. Teeth, hardened long before adulthood, act as silent witnesses to childhood. The isotopes locked inside them oxygen and strontium absorbed from food and water record the geology and climate of the land where a person was raised. By testing these markers, researchers could map the skeletons not just to death in York, but to their origins in distant corners of the empire. The results were astonishing. Out of nearly 20 tested, only a handful showed signatures of Yorkshire soil. The rest came from far away. Some bore the imprint of Gaul, modern France. Others pointed to the Germanic provinces, and at least one carried markers of the Mediterranean, a sun-baked land far removed from Britain's grey skies. And one man, remarkably, traced back to Syria. The DNA deepened the picture. The genomes extracted from 7 skeletons revealed men of varied ancestry. Most matched the Celtic British population, their roots local to the island, but one stood apart, a man of Middle Eastern origin, his genetic heritage tying him to the Roman East. This confirmed what the isotopes had suggested. The York Cemetery was no closed-in community. It was a gathering of strangers, men who had travelled, willingly or not, across the empire to meet their end in Britain. This diversity fits both gladiators, asses, and soldiers. Gladiator schools recruited slaves, captives, and volunteers from across the empire. The legions, tattoo, were Mumkelting's POTS units, composed of men from Gaul, Syria, Spain, Africa. To see such origins in York is no surprise, but the concentration of young, strong men most in their 20s and 30s, narrows the possibilities. These were not townsfolk. They were fighters, captives, or condemned. The bones told other stories. Strong muscle attachments along arms and shoulders hinted at lives of physical strain. Several skeletons displayed asymmetry, right arms larger than left, consistent with repetitive weapon training. Healed fractures showed men who had survived earlier violence, only to meet brutal deaths later. Then there were the fresh wounds, sword cuts across neck vertebrae, skulls crushed with blunt force. Some bore the marks of swift decapitation, others, hesitation blows. The cemetery recorded not just death, but struggle. Each discovery added to the puzzle, but none solved it. Gladiators or soldiers, captives or criminals, the science confirmed diversity, violence, and ritual, but the full story remained elusive. And yet, one more layer remains to explore, not just who they were, but how Rome itself saw them: heroes, victims, or something in between. To answer that, we must look at the empire's obsession with glory and death. To grasp the fate of the York dead, one must step into the Roman imagination, a world where death was not an end, but a stage, and where the line between punishment and honor blurred with every drop of blood spilled in the arena. Romans feared dishonorable death more than death itself. To die without recognition, without meaning, was to vanish into nothingness. But to die in combat, or to meet execution with composure, could elevate even the lowliest to a kind of twisted glory. Writers of the empire often describe criminals or gladiators who faced the sword without flinching as admirable, almost noble, in their final moment. To the crowd, such courage turned shame into spectacle, and spectacle into memory. The amphitheater was the perfect crucible for this philosophy. Citizens cheered as men fought to survive. And in those desperate clashes, Rome saw reflected its own ideals: discipline, endurance, strength. For soldiers, death in battle brought honor. For gladiators, a death in the arena earned applause. Even execution, if staged before an audience, became a communal reminder of power and order. And this mindset helps explain the contradictions of York. Benlambarn meant decapitated, clear signs of violence and punishment, yet buried with care, with offerings of meat and ritual. Their deaths may have been cruel, but the manner of their burial suggests respect. Perhaps they had fought well in the arena and earned admiration in the moment of defeat. Or perhaps they had been soldiers, condemned by politics, but honored privately by comrades who dared to defy Rome's erasure. Roman culture reveled in these paradoxes. It celebrated the victor while respecting the vanquished if he met death with dignity. It condemned rebels but admired their bravery. Even enemies of the state could become symbols of stoic endurance. This tension between cruelty and honor saturates Roman history, from the spectacle of gladiators to the tales of generals falling on their swords. For the York men, whatever their true identities, their final resting place reflects this duality. Death stripped them of heads, but burial returned them dignity. They were both victims of Rome's ruthless system and participants in its grand narrative of glory. But the story does not end in antiquity. For centuries, these skeletons lay in silence until their discovery reignited fascination. And as archaeologists and historians debated their fate, another connection emerged. One that tied the mysteries of York back to the earlier enigma of the cursed ring. Two stories, separated by miles and centuries, bound together by legend and curiosity. The headless men of York might have remained a curious footnote, just as the golden ring of Silvianus might have been forgotten in a private library. But history has a way of breathing again. when the right discovery or the right imagination brings it back to life. In the late 19th century, the cursed ring and its tablets sparked speculation that still lingers: a theft, a curse, and the defiance of a thief who engraved his own name over stolen property. A millennium later, archaeologists uncovered the headless Romans, men who lived and died beneath the shadow of empire, seemingly separate. These two tales both speak to Rome's iron grip and the fragments of humanity left in its wake. Then came the 20th century. Fellow Mortimer Wheeler, excavating the Lydney Temple of Nodens, called upon a rising philologist at Oxford, a man fascinated by ancient languages and myth. J.R.R. Tolkien studied the obscure god's name and the tale of the cursed ring. Scholars cannot prove that this encounter inspired the one ring of his legendarium. Yet the parallels: a stolen ring, a curse that follows, a relic that binds men and gods, are impossible to ignore. History and fantasy intertwined. The York skeletons, too, became more than bones. Their discovery in the early 2000s turned suburban gardens into a window on Rome's brutality. To some, they were gladiators who thrilled crowds before falling to the sword. To others, soldiers or rebels cut down by imperial wrath. And the truth may never be certain, but the image endures: headless men buried with care, their silence echoing across centuries. Together, the cursed ring and the headless Romans remind us that history is never truly buried, and a farmer's plough, a construction trench, or the curiosity of an antiquarian can awaken mysteries thought long forgotten. Each find pulls us closer to voices that once whispered, shouted, or cursed into the void, and in that act of rediscovery, legend is reborn. The curse of Silvianus now walks alongside Tolkien's fiction. The headless Romans march again in the imaginations of scholars and storytellers alike. They are not just relics, they are mirrors of power and theft, glory and cruelty, memory and myth, and so we close where we began, with fragments of the past demanding to be remembered. For if a ring can carry a curse across centuries, and bones can speak louder than words, then history itself is never dead. It is only waiting for us to listen. When we step back from the cursed ring of Silvianus and the headless men of York, a striking truth emerges. Both stories are less about relics and bones, and more about what they reveal of human nature: greed, faith, cruelty. Honor threads woven into every civilization, repeating across centuries in new guises. The ring tells of theft and divine vengeance. The man, Silvius, so desperate for justice that he carved the curse into lead and offered it to the gods. Turns. Another man, Senicianus, so audacious that he inscribed his name onto stolen gold, invoking protection from the very deity meant to punish him. The conflict between them is eternal, the victim demanding retribution, the thief demanding absolution. The York skeletons reveal the other side of Roman power. Men trained, shackled, condemned, they're forced to fight or executed with spectacle, and their decapitations speak of brutality, but their burials whisper of respect. Even in death, Rome displayed its paradox: merciless in judgment, yet meticulous in ritual. The empire needed both cruelty and reverence to sustain itself, and across time, these echoes find new voices. In Tolkien's fiction, the cursed ring becomes myth, reshaped for modern fears of power and corruption. In archaeological reports, the headless men become case studies, their lives reconstructed from scars and isotopes. And in both, we see the past not as distant but as hauntingly familiar. We still struggle with greed, still honor warriors, still wrestle with justice and cruelty. Perhaps that is why these stories endure. They remind us that history is not just dates and names, but living questions. What drives a man to steal and defy a curse? What society buries its condemned with food for the afterlife? And why, even now, do we feel compelled to tell and retell these tales, binding them into legend? The cursed ring may never yield absolute proof of its link to the Lydney tablet. The headless Romans may never reveal whether they were gladiators, soldiers, or rebels. Yet certainty is not the point, and the mystery itself keeps them alive, drawing us closer to the minds and fears of those who lived 2 millennia ago. And so, as the soil of Britain continues to hide its secrets, we must ask what else lies waiting to be unearthed. For every ring and every skeleton uncovered, countless more remain beneath our feet, silent but unforgotten, ready to echo once more when we are willing to listen. Every civilization leaves behind more than ruins. It leaves debts, promises, and curses that outlast the stones themselves. The story of the ring of Silvianus and the headless Romans of York reminds us that remembrance carries a price. For Silvianus, the price was despair. Imagine him kneeling in the dim light of Lydney's temple, etching his curse onto lead with trembling hands. He vowed half the value of his lost ring to Nodens, desperate for divine justice. Yet centuries passed, and his ring lay far away in Hampshire soil, untouched by gods or men. The curse endured, but his vengeance never came, and his story is remembered, but not because he won. It is remembered because his word survived. For Senicianus, the price was arrogance. He thought himself clever, engraving his name and a Christian blessing onto stolen gold, as if words could shield him from divine wrath. But in the end, his legacy is not triumph, but infamy. His name endures only because it was cursed. Memory does not always favor the victor. The York skeletons show another kind of cost. Their deaths were violent, but their burials were careful. Their bodies fed to the soil alongside offerings of meat. Some demanded their blood, but their community, or perhaps their captors, still gave them dignity. In that paradox lies the truth of empire honor and brutality, bound so tightly that neither can be separated. The men are remembered not because of who they were as individuals, but because their bones tell a collective story of Rome's shadow. The price of memory is that we do not choose how we are remembered. Some echo as heroes, others as villains, others are only as puzzles for future generations. Silvius, Senicianus, the nameless gladiators, the headless dead, all are remembered through fragments, incomplete and uncertain. Yet in those fragments, they achieve a kind of immortality. And what of us, our relics, our inscriptions, our bones, will they be understood, or misread, or forgotten? The cursed ring and the York graves remind us that history is not just what happened, but what survives, and how others choose to tell it. History rarely closes its stories cleanly. Instead, it leaves threads, some frayed, some knotted, that weave into legend. The cursed ring of Silvianus and the headless Romans of York are not simply relics. They are invitations to wonder, to imagine, to fear. The ring embodies the uneasy marriage of faiths in late Roman Britain. Venus engraved on its face, a Christian prayer carved around its band. It is an object of contradiction, caught between two worlds. For centuries, it lay silent beneath a Hampshire field until a farmer's plough revealed it once more. Its re-emergence rekindled not only a mystery, but also a legacy. One so compelling, it may have echoed into Tolkien's mythology. Whether or not the ring inspired the One Ring, its power lies in suggestion. In the way story can leap across centuries to spark imagination anew, the headless Romans, too, refuse to be silenced. Archaeologists read their bones like manuscripts, scars of combat, shackles of captivity, careful decapitations that blur the line between execution and ritual. Were they gladiators? Condemned men? Soldiers punished for betrayal? Each theory adds to their legend, their cemetery. Once a quiet patch of York soil, now speaks with unsettling clarity about Rome's hunger for spectacle, order, and control. Together, the ring and the graves remind us that history is not static. It shifts with every discovery, in every retelling. What begins as fact blurs into folklore, then returns as scholarship, then transforms again in the minds of storytellers. The cursed ring becomes a symbol of human greed and divine vengeance. The headless Romans become emblems of brutality and respect intertwined. Their legacy is not just in museums or textbooks, but in the questions they force us to ask. What does it mean to be remembered? Who decides which names survive, and why do we still hunger for stories of curses, executions, and lost empires? Perhaps the answer lies in the simple truth that legends outlast certainty. A curse tablet, a gold ring, a row of decapitated skeletons, each fragment is incomplete, but together they form a chorus, whispering across time that the past is never truly buried. And so, the story closes not with answers, but with echoes. The curse of Silvianus, the arrogance of Senicianus, the silence of the headless dead all remain, waiting. For history, like legend, never ends. It only waits for the next voice willing to tell its tale.